Close your eyes for just a second and picture this. You packed your bag on a Friday. You drove, maybe 2 hours, maybe 4, to your son's house or your daughter's apartment or wherever your family lives now. And for 2 or 3 days, the house was full. Full of noise, full of little feet running down the hallway, full of voices talking over each other at dinner. Your grandkids called your name. You held someone's hand. For a little while, everything felt exactly the way life is supposed to feel. And then Sunday came. You hugged everyone goodbye. You got in your car. And somewhere on that drive home, maybe 30 minutes in, maybe the moment you unlocked your front door and heard nothing, something shifted. Not a big dramatic breakdown. Just a quiet, creeping feeling you couldn't quite name. Maybe you felt sad. Maybe you felt hollow. Maybe you felt angry, and then immediately ashamed of feeling angry. Maybe you walked through your own house like a stranger. Maybe you sat down and thought, what is wrong with me? I just had a wonderful time. So why do I feel like this? If any of that sounds familiar, I want you to know something before we go any further. Nothing is wrong with you. What you're feeling has a name. It has a psychological explanation. And today, I'm going to give you 5 of them. I've been a practicing psychologist for over 40 years. The majority of my career has been spent working with adults over the age of 55, in private practice, in group settings, and in consultation with families navigating the very real complexities of later life. And I want to tell you something I've observed again and again in my office. The fastest growing emotional concern I hear from people in their 60s and 70s is not what most people would expect. It's not fear of death. It's not chronic pain. It's this. I don't understand why I feel so bad after visiting my kids. You are not alone in this. And you are not broken. Let's talk about what's actually happening. Nightmare number 1. I call it the empty house crash. Here's what it looks like from the outside. You come home from a wonderful visit. You put your bag down. You maybe make yourself a cup of tea. And then you just can't settle. You walk from room to room. You pick up your phone and put it down. You feel restless, irritable, a little foggy. Sleep doesn't come easily that night. And the next morning you wake up and it's still there. This flat, low-grade sense of wrongness that you can't shake. From the outside, it can look like depression. And that's exactly why it becomes a nightmare. Because people start to panic. Am I depressed? Is this it? Is this what the rest of my life feels like? Let me explain what's actually happening in your brain. When you spend concentrated time with people you love, especially grandchildren, your body produces something called oxytocin. You've probably heard it called the bonding hormone. It surges during physical contact, during laughter, during the simple act of being in a room full of people you belong to. And then you leave. And that hormone level drops. Sharply. What you are experiencing is not a character flaw. It is a neurochemical contrast effect. Your nervous system spent the weekend in a high state of warmth and stimulation, and now it's recalibrating. That recalibration feels terrible, but it is temporary. So what do you do about it? The most effective thing I've found, and this sounds almost too simple, is to plan for the crash before it happens. Don't leave the visit and improvise your way through the return. Before you get in the car to drive home, know what you're coming home to. Have a podcast you've been saving. Have a phone call scheduled with a friend for Sunday evening. Have a walk planned for Monday morning. The crash is real, but you can build a landing pad. And the second piece of advice, give yourself a 48-hour grace period. Do not make any significant emotional decisions in the 2 days after a visit. Don't have the hard conversation with your adult child. Don't evaluate your life. Don't draw any big conclusions. Just let your nervous system come back to baseline. It will. Nightmare number 2 is one that very few people will admit to out loud. I call it the invisible grandparent syndrome. You were there for the whole visit. You were physically present for every meal, every activity, every moment. But somewhere along the way, you got the distinct feeling that you weren't really seen. Your adult child was distracted, on their phone, managing logistics, putting out fires with the kids. The grandchildren were absorbed in their own world. The conversation at dinner moved fast, covered topics you barely recognized, and then it was over. And on the drive home, a quiet thought started forming. Do I even matter to them? I want to be careful here, because this thought is one of the most painful thoughts a person can have, and it deserves to be handled with real precision. Here's the psychological truth. There is a difference between feeling invisible and being invisible. And for most of the people I've worked with, what they're experiencing is the feeling, not the reality. Your adult children are, in many cases, completely overwhelmed. They are raising kids, managing careers, running households, and doing all of it with less community support than any generation in recent memory. When they seem distracted, it is almost never because they don't value you. It is because they are drowning, and you happen to be the one person in the room they trust enough not to perform for. That sounds backwards, I know. But it's true. You are safe to ignore, in the best sense of the word. That said, the feeling still matters, and it still needs to be addressed. What I recommend is a simple, low-pressure conversation, not a confrontation, not a guilt-producing moment, just an honest, specific request. Something like, I really love our visits. I'd love if we could carve out even 30 minutes where it's just us, no phones, no chaos, just you and me. Specific, gentle, actionable. Most adult children, when asked this way, will say yes. Nightmare number 3. This is the one that surprises people the most. It is grief, not for anyone who has died, but for something harder to define. You're at the dinner table and your 8-year-old grandchild says something small. Maybe they reference an inside joke with their other grandparents, or they talk about a milestone you didn't know about, and you feel a sudden, quiet ache. You notice that your adult child handles a parenting situation differently than you would have. You try to play on the floor with the grandkids, and your knees won't cooperate the way they used to. And underneath all of it, running like a current, is this unspoken awareness. Time is passing, and I can't get it back. This is called ambiguous grief. It's grief for something that hasn't died, but has changed. The family life you imagined. The grandparent you intended to be. The version of your body that could do more. The closeness you assumed would be automatic. The reason this becomes a nightmare is that our culture has no script for it. We know how to grieve a death. We don't know how to grieve the passage of time while everything and everyone is still alive and technically fine. So people swallow it. They smile through it. They tell themselves they're being ungrateful. You are not ungrateful. You are grieving. And grief needs to be named to lose its power. Here is something I give to many of my patients. I call it the honest page. After a visit, sit down with a journal, or even just a piece of paper, and answer this one question honestly. What did I hope this visit would feel like, and what did I actually feel? Not to dwell, not to spiral, just to name it. Because grief that is named becomes something you carry with you. Grief that is unnamed becomes something that carries you. Nightmare number 4. And I'm going to need you to stay with me here, because this one is the most uncomfortable. It is the resentment you're ashamed of. You love your children. You love your grandchildren. That is not in question. And yet, somewhere in the middle of the visit, or on the drive home, or in the quiet of the night, there was a flash of anger. Maybe your son corrected something you said in front of the grandkids. Maybe your daughter made a parenting choice that you found hard to watch. Maybe you realized, somewhere around the 3rd hour of being handed a screaming toddler, that you had driven 4 hours and spent $300 to serve as unpaid childcare with no one asking how you were doing. And then, right behind the anger, came the shame. What kind of parent am I? What kind of grandparent resents their own family? Let me be very direct with you. Resentment is not a character flaw. Resentment is information. Every time resentment appears, it is pointing at something underneath it, usually an unmet expectation or an unspoken need. The feeling itself is not the problem. What becomes a problem is when we bury it. Because buried resentment doesn't disappear. It comes out sideways. In the slightly too sharp comment at dinner. In the withdrawal that happens for weeks after a visit. Sometimes in physical symptoms, headaches, fatigue, chest tightness, that seem to have no medical cause. So what do you do with it? First, find it. Name the specific thing that triggered it. Not, I was frustrated, but what exactly happened. The more specific you can be, the more useful the information becomes. Second, ask yourself what need was underneath it. Were you hoping to feel appreciated? Were you hoping to feel consulted? Were you hoping to feel like a peer, not just a grandparent prop? Third, use what I call the release valve. Write the letter you will never send. Write it completely honestly. The frustration, the hurt, the specific incidents. Write it all the way to the end. And then don't send it. Because the purpose isn't to punish anyone. The purpose is to let the pressure out before it builds into something that damages the relationship you're trying to protect. Nightmare number 5. And in some ways, this is the deepest one. I call it the existential spiral. It usually starts on the drive home, or sometimes late on the first night back, when you can't sleep and the house is quiet. A thought appears, not dramatic, almost gentle in its arrival, and it asks, what is my life, now that they don't need me anymore? For so many people over 60, their identity, the answer to the question, who am I, was deeply woven into their role as a parent, as the person needed, as the center of gravity for the family. And at some point, quietly, without a ceremony or a formal announcement, that role changed. You are still loved, but you are no longer the axis. And visiting your kids, seeing the full, busy, self-sufficient life they've built, can make that change impossible to ignore. There's a psychologist and theorist named Erik Erikson who described the central developmental challenge of later life as a conflict between what he called generativity and stagnation. Generativity means continuing to contribute, to create, to matter in ways that extend beyond yourself. Stagnation is what happens when we stop, when we lose the thread of purpose and begin to feel like we're simply waiting. A family visit, paradoxically, can accelerate the spiral. Because for a few days, you were in it. You were needed. You were touched. You were real in the way that only human connection makes us real. And then you came home to a life that may not yet have found its new shape. This is not a crisis. I want to be very clear about that. This is a developmental invitation. It is your psyche asking you, in the only way it knows how, to build something. To answer the questions you've been too busy to ask. To take seriously the years ahead of you, not as a long goodbye, but as a chapter with its own purpose, its own texture, its own value. I use 3 questions with my patients at this stage of life. I'll leave them with you now. First, what do I still want to create, in any sense of that word? Second, who still needs what only I can give? Not in a desperate, grasping way, but genuinely. Your accumulated wisdom, your specific history, your particular way of seeing the world. Who benefits from that? Third, what have I not yet done that I still want to do? These are not small questions, but they are the right ones, and they deserve your full attention. Before I give you my final recommendations, I want to step back and name something. All 5 of these nightmares, the empty house crash, the invisible grandparent syndrome, the unexpected grief, the ashamed resentment, the existential spiral, they all come from the same root. Your relationship with your family has changed, and no one held a ceremony for the change. You moved, at some point in the last decade or two, from being needed to being loved. And those feel very different. Needed has urgency. Needed has a role. Loved is real, perhaps more purely real, but it can feel passive. It can feel like standing at the edge of something, watching. And here is the truth I've come to after 40 years of sitting with people at this stage of life. The solution is not to see your family less. The solution is to build a life full enough, purposeful enough, connected enough, that when you visit, the visit is a gift. not a lifeline. When your sense of identity and purpose lives only in those visits, every goodbye becomes a small bereavement. But when you have a life you're genuinely living, your own rhythms, your own community, your own ongoing projects of meaning, then the visit becomes what it was always meant to be, a beautiful addition to an already full life. Let me close with 5 practical things, grounded in research and in decades of clinical experience, that genuinely help. Number 1. Set an intention before the visit. Before you get in the car, ask yourself one question: what am I going there for? Not for validation. Not to see if they notice how hard you've worked. Go for the joy of being together. That's it. When you know why you're going, you're far less likely to come home devastated that your expectations weren't met. Number 2. Build a post-visit recovery plan. This is non-negotiable. Before you leave, know what your Sunday evening looks like. Know what Monday morning holds. Schedule a call, a walk, a class, something that reattaches you to your own life within 24 hours of returning. Don't leave recovery to chance. Number 3. Build a peer community. I cannot overstate how important this is. You need people who are living what you are living. Not people 20 years younger, not your adult children, but peers in your own life stage who understand the specific texture of being 65 or 70 in the world today. A church group, a walking group, a book club, a volunteer organization. This is not optional. It is medicine. Number 4. Learn one communication skill. Not therapy. Not a difficult confrontation. Just one skill. How to make a specific, non-blaming request of your adult child. I would love X. Can we try that? Practice it. Use it. Relationships improve one honest request at a time. Number 5. Give yourself a purpose structure outside of family. A creative project. A mentorship role. A cause you care about. Something that answers the question, who am I? With something other than someone's parent or someone's grandparent. You are those things, and you are more. Here is what I want to leave you with. These 5 nightmares. The crash, the invisibility, the grief, the resentment, the spiral. They are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are not signs that something is wrong with your family. They are signs that you care deeply, that you feel things fully, and that you are at a stage of life that deserves just as much psychological attention, just as much honest support, as any other. You raised a family. You built a life. And now life is asking you to build it again, in a different shape, for a different chapter. That is not a loss. That is a remarkable opportunity. I would love to hear from you. Which of these 5 hit closest to home? Leave a comment below. Be honest. Be specific. I read every single one, and I often respond. And if you know someone, a friend, a sibling, anyone over 60 who drives home from a family visit and sits in that quiet house wondering what's wrong with them, please share this video. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone is let them know they are not alone. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next week.